Warren Beatty, a man who reportedly dated nearly every leading actress in Hollywood between 1960 and 1990, was said to have harbored a secret beyond his legendary romantic conquests. According to his longtime driver Michael Reynolds, Beatty possessed an extraordinarily sensitive sense of smell and an obsessive fixation on personal hygiene. Reynolds, who drove Beatty from 1965 to 1992, claimed that after dates Beatty would slide into the back seat, immediately roll down the window regardless of weather, and deliver calm clinical assessments of his companion's hygiene. There were no anger or drama, just detached observations offered in the same measured tone he used on film sets. Beatty, Reynolds said, showered multiple times a day and often discarded shirts after a single wearing. Human smells, morning breath, or any sign of bodily reality were, in his mind, unacceptable. Reynolds believed Beatty expected women to be perfectly maintained machines, an impossible standard no one could truly meet. One of the most memorable examples, according to Reynolds, involved Madonna during the early 1990s when she and Beatty worked together on Dick Tracy. After the film's premiere at Grauman's Chinese Theater, Reynolds recalled picking Beatty up alone. Beatty reportedly sat in silence before remarking that Madonna changed her scent throughout the evening. He then launched into a detailed analysis of her perfume use, describing it as incense, sweat, and ambition, and said it felt strategic, almost invasive. Days later, Reynolds claimed Beatty stormed out of Madonna's place carrying his jacket, insisting she had sprayed perfume on it without his consent. The relationship ended shortly thereafter, not because Beatty thought she was dirty, but because her deliberate manipulation of scent seemed to threaten his sense of control. Jane Fonda, Reynolds said, fell into a different category. During a brief relationship in 1971, at the height of her political activism, Beatty allegedly became fixated on her refusal to use deodorant. Reynolds remembered picking them up from a Vietnam veterans fundraiser on a scorching summer day. When Beatty complained that Fonda had lectured him about aluminum and corporate chemicals instead of using conventional products, he was reportedly baffled that someone so meticulous about appearance and protest preparation would reject what he considered basic hygiene. Their arguments escalated over weeks, culminating in a tense ride home after another political event, during which Fonda reportedly accused Beatty of toxic cleanliness. For Beatty, Reynolds believed her stance challenged not only his preferences, but his assumptions about modern life. Joan Collins, by contrast, represented the opposite offense. Although Beatty's brief relationship with her predated Reynolds's employment, Reynolds claimed Beatty often referenced it years later. On the way to an industry dinner in the late 1970s, Beatty allegedly instructed Reynolds to keep the car windows open if Collins came near it. He described her perfume as overwhelming, even suffocating, and claimed that decades earlier her scent had lingered in his car upholstery long enough to require professional cleaning. After a brief air-kiss greeting at the event, Beatty reportedly returned to the car hours later, complaining that he could still taste her perfume and that it had given him a headache. Reynolds said Beatty wanted an impossible middle ground, where a woman smelled neither human nor artificial, and Collins symbolized excess in the opposite direction. Julie Christie was the exception, who troubled Beatty the most. Their long relationship, from 1967 to 1974, was, according to Reynolds, deeply meaningful to him. Yet even Christie could not escape Beatty's rigid standards. Reynolds recalled picking up a jet-lagged Beatty from LAX after a visit to Christie's farmhouse in England, and Beatty admitted almost hurt that she was the love of my life. But not always fresh in the mornings. He seemed genuinely unsettled by her habit of drinking coffee and reading before showering or brushing her teeth. Reynolds remembered tense morning drives to film sets and overheard Christie once remark that not everyone needed to taste like mouthwash at 6 in the morning. Beatty even asked Reynolds whether it was strange to shower immediately upon waking, a rare moment of self-doubt that nearly caused Reynolds to crash the car. Brigitte Bardot, Reynolds said, caused what he described as a complete sensory crisis. During the 1965 Cannes Film Festival, after returning from France, Beatty allegedly launched into a monologue about European attitudes toward the body and cleanliness. He was both repelled and fascinated by Bardot's comfort with natural scent and unshaven underarms, especially after a dinner where she had come straight from a yacht excursion with no shower, only a change of clothes. Beatty reportedly could not reconcile her global status as a beauty icon with what he saw as poor hygiene. The encounter ended abruptly, with Beatty cutting his trip short and later telling Reynolds that the French simply viewed bodies differently. Taken together, Reynolds believed these stories revealed far more about Warren Beatty than about the women themselves. None, he suggested, were unhygienic in any objective sense. Instead, each challenged Beatty's narrow fantasy of how women should look, smell, and exist. Madonna's calculated scent, Fonda's political rejection of products, Collins's perfume maximalism, Christie's relaxed mornings, and Bardot's European sensuality all represented forms of independence that conflicted with Beatty's need for control. Reynolds concluded that Beatty wanted women who smelled like his idealized vision, not like real human beings. The irony, he said, was that Beatty's wandering finally ended when he met Annette Bening, a woman who made him worry about meeting someone else's standards. The first time Reynolds drove them together, Beatty reportedly asked whether the car smelled fresh enough. For the first time, Hollywood's most famous bachelor was the one being measured. From Reynolds' perspective, that moment marked a subtle but profound shift in Beatty's psychology. For decades, Warren Beatty had positioned himself as the ultimate evaluator, the man whose approval or rejection quietly determined the fate of countless romantic encounters. His standards, especially around cleanliness and scent, functioned less as preferences and more as defenses. Reynolds believed hygiene was Beatty's way of keeping intimacy at a safe, controllable distance. If a woman failed some invisible sensory test, the relationship could be dismissed without emotional risk. It was neat, efficient, and emotionally sterile. Annette Bening disrupted that system almost immediately. Reynolds recalled that Beatty was unusually quiet after their early dates. Not in his typical analytical way, but contemplative. Instead of delivering assessments, he asked questions. Hey, did Reynolds think the restaurant they'd visited smelled musty? Was the air conditioning in the car too strong? Had Reynolds noticed any lingering odors from a previous passenger? These were concerns Reynolds had never heard from him before. Beatty, who once assumed the environment should automatically conform to his expectations, was suddenly aware that he might be the one being judged. Reynolds noticed other changes as well. Beatty began allowing the windows to stay up after dates, even when traffic trapped them in warm Los Angeles nights. His obsessive post-date rituals softened. He still showered frequently, but the frantic urgency eased. Shirts lasted more than a single wearing. Reynolds didn't interpret these changes as concessions so much as recalibrations. Beatty wasn't abandoning his standards. He was learning that standards could be negotiated rather than enforced. The deeper transformation, Reynolds believed, lay in Beatty's relationship to control. With previous partners, scent had symbolized dominance. Beatty decided what was acceptable and what wasn't, what crossed the line and what could be tolerated. With Bening, that power dynamic reversed. She didn't mock his fastidiousness, but she didn't bend to it either. Reynolds said Beatty once recounted an early disagreement in which he suggested a different soap brand for her bathroom. Bening reportedly listened, smiled, and continued using whatever she preferred. The matter was never revisited. For a man accustomed to silent compliance or quiet resistance, the calm finality of her independence was disarming. Reynolds came to believe that Beatty's legendary reputation as a womanizer had obscured a more fragile truth. Beatty wasn't endlessly indulgent. He was endlessly searching for an impossible equilibrium where desire never collided with reality. Hygiene complaints were simply the most tangible expression of that struggle. Smell, after all, is intimate and uncontrollable. You can close your eyes to flaws, ignore habits, reinterpret words, but scent bypasses rationalization. It is immediate, physical, and deeply personal. Beatty's intolerance for natural smells, Reynolds suspected, reflected a deeper discomfort with vulnerability itself. Looking back, Reynolds felt that each woman on Beatty's private list represented a different challenge to his carefully maintained emotional distance. Madonna's calculated perfume unsettled him because it suggested manipulation rather than submission. Jane Fonda's rejection of deodorant confronted him with ideology overpowering aesthetics. Joan Collins's overwhelming fragrance mocked his desire for sensory neutrality. Julie Christie's unfiltered mornings forced intimacy into the most unguarded hours of the day. Brigitte Bardot's unapologetic physicality dismantled his belief that beauty required erasure of the body's realities. None of these women were careless. They were autonomous. Reynolds often emphasized that Beatty never spoke cruelly about these women. There were no insults, no laughter, no sense of superiority. The assessments were delivered with almost scientific detachment. That, Reynolds thought, made them more unsettling. Beatty wasn't judging from a place of arrogance so much as fear. He needed the world, especially the women closest to him, to remain orderly, predictable, and sanitized. Anything that reminded him of disorder's wet breath, lingering perfume, Unwashed hair threatened that illusion. As years passed and Beatty settled into marriage, Reynolds observed that the story stopped. There were no more post-date evaluations because there were no more dates to evaluate. The car rides changed in tone. Conversations shifted toward work, politics, films, and eventually family. Once a central obsession, receded into the background. Reynolds interpreted this not as a loss of sensitivity, but as a gain in tolerance. He had not suddenly embraced human misanthropy. He had accepted that intimacy required enduring it. Reynolds admitted that he sometimes wondered how many relationships might have unfolded differently if Beatty had reached that realization earlier. Julie Christie, in particular, lingered in his mind. Reynolds believed Beatty loved her deeply, but lacked the emotional flexibility to reconcile love with imperfection at that stage of his life. With Annette Bening, timing and maturity aligned, Beatty no longer needed to protect himself with impossible standards. He was willing, perhaps for the first time, to be uncomfortable. In Reynolds' final reflection, Beatty's story wasn't really about hygiene at all. It was about power, fear, and the human tendency to disguise emotional boundaries as preferences. Scent became Beatty's shorthand for compatibility, a way to rationalize distance without admitting vulnerability. The women who failed his standards weren't failures in any meaningful sense. They were mirrors, each reflecting a version of independence Beatty wasn't yet prepared to accommodate. By the end of his driving career, Reynolds felt he had witnessed a quiet evolution. The man who once opened car windows immediately after, dates now occasionally forgot to open them at all. The hypertensive nose that once cataloged every perceived offense learned not to ignore, then to coexist with imperfection. Reynolds never claimed Beatty became easygoing. He remained meticulous, controlled, and exacting. But the sharp edge dulled. The final irony, Reynolds often said, was that Warren Beatty's greatest transformation had nothing to do with fame, age, or exhaustion. It came from encountering someone who neither challenged his standards aggressively, nor adapted herself to them. Annette Bening simply existed as she was, confident enough not to negotiate her physical presence. In doing so, she forced Beatty to confront the one variable he had never truly examined: himself. For a man who spent decades measuring women against an invisible ruler of cleanliness and control, that realization marked the true end of his legendary wandering. Not because he finally found someone who met his impossible standards, but because he learned at last to live with standards that could bend. Reynolds maintained that this bending of standards did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, in small, almost invisible moments that only someone sitting behind the wheel every day would notice. Beatty still noticed smells. Never disappeared, but the urgency to correct, comment, or control them faded. Reynolds recalled one afternoon when they were stuck in traffic on Sunset Boulevard behind a delivery truck belching exhaust. Years earlier, Beatty would have complained immediately, perhaps demanded a route change. Instead, he simply cracked the window an inch and continued discussing a script revision. Reynolds said that tiny gesture felt monumental. It was the first time he'd seen Beatty adapt instead of react. With distance, Reynolds began reinterpreting earlier years through a more compassionate lens. At the time, the post-date assessments had seemed eccentric, even cold. In retrospect, Reynolds believed Beatty was a man deeply uncomfortable with the unpredictability of closeness. Hygiene became the language through which he articulated discomfort he didn't have the emotional vocabulary to express directly. Saying someone didn't smell right was easier than admitting he felt overwhelmed, confused, or emotionally exposed. Reynolds emphasized that Beatty never framed these women as lesser. In fact, he often spoke of their intelligence, talent, and magnetism with genuine admiration. The contradiction puzzled Reynolds for years. How could a man be so drawn to powerful, unconventional women and yet recoil from the physical realities that accompanied that independence? Eventually, Reynolds concluded that Beatty was attracted precisely to what frightened him. These women embodied freedom, self-definition, and bodily autonomy. His discomfort with their scent was simply the point where admiration collided with fear. The Hollywood context mattered too. Beatty came of age in an era when female stars were marketed as immaculate fantasies. Studios controlled diets, appearances, even public behavior. Cleanliness wasn't just personal, it was ideological. To Beatty, who thrived within that system, hygiene symbolized professionalism, discipline, and control. Women who deviated from those norms weren't just challenging his personal taste, they were undermining the mythology he had been taught to revere. Reynolds recalled Beatty once remarking, half seriously, that nothing kills romance faster than reality arriving too early. At the time, Reynolds laughed it off. Years later, the line struck him as painfully revealing. Beatty wanted intimacy, but only if it unfolded on his terms, at his pace, filtered through fantasy. Morning breath, sweat, and scent were reminders. That reality does not wait for permission. As Beatty aged, Reynolds noticed that the fear of reality softened. Fatherhood, in particular, altered his relationship to bodily imperfection. Reynolds said Beatty never complained about the smells associated with children. Diapers spit up, the chaos of family life seemed to bypass the sensitivities that once governed his romantic life. Reynolds interpreted this as evidence that Beatty's issue had never been about smell itself, but about adult intimacy and the vulnerability it required. In quieter moments, Reynolds admitted to feeling conflicted about sharing these stories. He didn't see them as gossip or exposed material, but as fragments of a psychological portrait. Beatty was not a villain in his own narrative, merely a man shaped by his era, his fame, and his fears. Their women he dated weren't casualties, so much as catalysts, each pushing against the limits of what he could tolerate at that point in his life. Reynolds also noted how Beatty's reputation suffered from oversimplification. The public image of an insatiable playboy missed the deeper pattern. Beatty wasn't endlessly indulgent. He was endlessly selective, searching for a feeling of safety disguised as perfection. When that illusion cracked, he moved on, not out of boredom, but out of discomfort. In later years, Beatty occasionally referenced his past with a tone that surprised Reynolds. There was no nostalgia, but there was a hint of regret. Not regret for the relationship's ending, but for the rigidity that had made endings inevitable. Reynolds remembered Beatty once saying, almost to himself, "I used to think standards kept chaos out. Turns out, they just kept people out." Yeah. It was the closest Reynolds ever heard him come to an outright confession. By the time Reynolds retired, the man he left behind was not transformed into someone carefree or casual. Beatty remained precise, observant, and controlled. The harshness was gone. The ruler he once held so firmly now had flexibility. He no longer mistook discomfort for incompatibility or difference for deficiency. Reynolds believed this was the real conclusion to Beatty's long romantic saga. Not the tally of famous names, not the whispered legends, but the slow recognition that intimacy cannot be sterilized. Love, by its nature, involves tolerating the unfiltered presence of another human being. Breath, scent, habit, and imperfection are not obstacles to connection. They are proof of it, in the end, Reynolds said. Warren Beatty didn't stop wandering because he found someone flawless. He stopped because he finally accepted that flaws were not threats. They were the price of closeness. And for a man who had spent decades keeping the windows open, learning to sit with the air exactly as it was became his quietest and most profound victory. As Reynolds tells it, the final lesson Beatty absorbed was not dramatic or cinematic. There was no single revelation, no grand apology to the past, no moment of public reckoning. It arrived quietly, through repetition and routine, through mornings that were no longer scrutinized and evenings that no longer required analysis. Beatty learned that intimacy could survive without constant evaluation. A closeness did not collapse simply because the world was imperfect or unpredictable. The vigilance that once governed his romantic life slowly lost its purpose. Reynolds believed this shift explained why Beatty's later years felt calmer, almost subdued compared to the chaos of his earlier reputation. The hunger that once drove him from one connection to another faded, replaced by something steadier. He no longer seemed to be searching for an ideal arrangement of scent, order, and control. Instead, he appeared content to exist within the ordinary rhythms of shared life, where comfort mattered more than precision. What struck Reynolds most was how little Beatty spoke about hygiene at all by the end. The topic that once dominated post-date conversations vanished entirely. In its place were concerns that felt more human and less defensive, worries about work, about time passing, about whether he was being fair, present, or kind enough. Reynolds saw this as evidence that BDS's earlier fixations had been scaffolding, structure built to protect something fragile underneath. Once that fragility was acknowledged, the scaffolding could come down. Reynolds never claimed that. Beatty became emotionally transparent or openly reflective. He remained private to the end, a man more comfortable with observation than confession. But the absence of judgment spoke louder than any admission. Silence, in this case, meant peace. The need to categorize, rank, and reject had dissolved, and replaced by acceptance that intimacy is not something to be perfected. Only sustained in reflecting on the women who passed through Beatty's life, Reynolds was careful not to frame them as lessons or stepping stones. They were complete individuals who lived fully as themselves, often in defiance of expectations. If Beatty learned from them, it was indirectly, through the accumulation of experiences that gradually revealed the limits of his own worldview. Each woman represented a boundary he could not cross at the time. Together, they mapped the perimeter of his emotional readiness. Reynolds often returned to the image of the car window. For years, it had been Beatty's instinctive response, the barrier between himself and discomfort. Opening it meant relief, distance, control. Leaving it closed required tolerance, trust, and vulnerability. By the end, Reynolds said, Beatty rarely reached for the window at all. The air inside was no longer something to escape. That, Reynolds believed, was the true ending of Warren Beatty's long, complicated romantic story. Not a list of names, not a legend inflated by rumor, but a quiet internal adjustment. Beatty did not abandon his sensitivity or his preferences. ADD. He simply stopped mistaking them for moral truths. He learned that discomfort was not danger and that difference was not failure. In the final accounting, Reynolds said, Beatty's journey was less about the women he dated and more about the man he slowly became. The obsessions that once defined him softened into traits he could live with rather than live by. He discovered that control could be exchanged for connection, and that perfection was a poor substitute for presence. For someone who had spent decades managing every sensory detail, learning to share space without policing it was a radical act. It did not make Beatty ordinary, but it made him human. And perhaps that was the outcome he had been circling all along without knowing how to name it. Reynolds ended his reflections with a simple observation. He didn't change who he was, he said. He just stopped fighting what other people were. And in that surrender, subtle and uncelebrated, Warren Beatty finally found what his impossible standards had kept just out of reach for so long. The ease of letting someone else exist fully and freely beside him.